How did you make a terrible teacher regret screwing with your education? My senior year of high school, I'd been one of the top students in my class. I'd been ranked third out of 412 students. I'd been applying to Ivy League schools. My AP chemistry teacher, Mr. Whitfield, had been the only obstacle in my way. He'd been a 48-year-old man who'd been at my school for 22 years. He'd been famously difficult. He told us at the start of the year that only 1 in 4 of you will get an A. I'd been determined to be that one. The thing about Mr. Whitfield is that he'd had a problem with me from day one. He'd been calling me by the wrong name for the first 3 weeks. He'd been making comments about my ambition. He'd been telling other students I was too eager. He'd been grading my work harder than other students' work. I'd been comparing graded assignments with my friend Persephone. We'd been doing the same work. She'd been getting A's and A pluses. I'd been getting B's and B minuses. The work had been nearly identical. By October, I'd realized he'd been targeting me. I'd been talking to my parents. They'd told me to just keep my head down. I'd been working twice as hard. I'd been getting up at 4 a.m. to study. I'd been staying up until midnight working on my chemistry. I'd been doing every extra credit assignment. I'd been earning A's on every test. I'd been still getting B's in his class. By December, my GPA had dropped from a 4.1 to a 3.6. That had been because of his class alone. I'd been told my Ivy League dreams might be affected. The thing is, I'd been documenting everything. I'd been keeping copies of every assignment. I'd been photographing every test before turning it in. On a Tuesday in January, I'd been at lunch when Persephone had told me something. She told me she'd been at her parents' country club the previous weekend. She told me Mr. Whitfield had been there. She told me he'd been talking to her father. She told me he'd been bragging about the affirmative action kids who'd been ruining college admissions. She told me he'd been laughing about how he'd been keeping a couple of them in their place this year. Persephone had been mortified. She told me she'd been wanting to tell me, but she'd been afraid. I'd been the only black student in his class. I'd been the only one whose grades had been mysteriously lower than my work warranted. My school had been a wealthy private school. I'd been one of about 11 black students in the entire school. I'd been on a partial scholarship. Mr. Whitfield had been a known problem at the school. 3 other black students who'd been before me had also been underperforming in his classes. Their parents had complained. The school had done nothing. Persephone had been willing to testify if I'd needed her to. I'd sat down with my parents that weekend. I'd told them everything. They'd told me they wanted to confront Mr. Whitfield directly. I'd told them I had a different idea. I'd contacted a civil rights attorney named Augustin Cabrera. He'd been a graduate of my high school from 1981. He'd been one of the first black students at my school. He'd been a successful attorney in Atlanta. He'd been on the school's board of trustees. I'd reached out to him through a connection my mother had. He'd agreed to meet with me. I'd brought my documentation. Augustin had been impressed. He told me he'd been wanting to do something about Mr. Whitfield for years. He told me he'd been quietly investigating him for 2 years. He'd been talking to other former students. He'd been building a case. He just needed a current student willing to participate. I'd told him I was willing. Augustin had taken my case pro bono. He'd filed a formal complaint with the school. He'd filed a complaint with the State Department of Education. The school had panicked. The headmaster had called my parents into his office within 2 days. He'd been apologetic. He'd been promising to investigate. The investigation had been formal. 3 other former students had testified. Mr. Whitfield had been suspended within 2 weeks. The school had hired an independent firm to review his grades. The firm had reviewed 3 years of his grading records. They'd found systematic bias against black students. The firm had identified 23 students who'd been graded unfairly. My corrected grade had been an A+. My GPA had been restored to a 4.2. I'd been accepted to my top choice Ivy League school. Mr. Whitfield had been fired. He'd lost his teaching license. He'd been sued by 3 of the students he'd affected. I'd graduated as valedictorian. Augustin had given the keynote speech at our graduation. I'd been hired by his law firm as a summer intern. I'd been going to law school at his firm's recommendation. I'd been going to specialize in civil rights education law. But last week I'd been working at Augustin's firm. We'd been going through old files. I'd found a file labeled Whitfield Investigation. Inside the file had something I hadn't expected. There had been a list of names. People who'd known about Mr. Whitfield. People who'd been doing nothing. One of the names had been my school's headmaster. Another name had been the head of the school's parent association. The third name had been someone I'd known well. Someone who'd been pretending to be my friend. I'd been staring at that list for what felt like forever. My eyes kept going back to the third name, but the third entry on the list wasn't just a name. It was a sentence. It read, Persephone's parents, per P's report to Headmaster Alfonso, March of the previous year. I read it again. Then I read it a third time. March of the previous year. That had been almost a full year before Persephone told me anything at that lunch in January. Almost a full year. Persephone had reported what she'd heard about Mr. Whitfield to Alfonso. She hadn't reported it to me. She'd gone to the headmaster, and then she'd sat next to me in chemistry for months. She'd watched me get up at 4 a.m. She'd watched my grades fall. She'd compared assignments with me week after week, seeing her A's next to my B's, and she'd said nothing. She'd had a rope the entire time, and she'd only thrown it when other people were already watching. My hands started shaking. I kept reading. There was a memo from Alfonso acknowledging Persephone's report. It was on school letterhead. It was dated 2 days after the March report, and at the bottom of the memo there was a note. It said, no further action recommended at this time. Parents of reporting student prefer discretion. Persephone's family hadn't just known about Mr. Whitfield. They'd actively asked the school to keep it quiet. Their daughter was getting A's. Their daughter wasn't being hurt, so why make a fuss? Why risk their standing at the school? They'd chosen their comfort over my future, and Persephone had gone along with it. I didn't go to Persephone. My first thought was to call her, to scream at her, to ask her how she could sit across from me at lunch and act like she cared, but I didn't do it. Instead, I picked up the file and walked straight to Augustin's office. I put the file down in front of him. I opened it to the page with the list. I pointed at the third entry. I said, did you know about this? Augustin looked at the page. He read it. Then he read it again. He went quiet. He sat back in his chair. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Then he said, I knew about the headmaster. I didn't know about this. He picked up the memo from Alfonso. He read the note at the bottom about the parents preferring discretion. He set it down carefully. He looked at me and said, this changes things. I asked him what he meant. He told me that Persephone's testimony during the formal complaint, the testimony that had helped build our case, the testimony where she'd talked about what she'd heard at the country club, all of it might not have been what I thought it was. He said she came forward only after I was already involved, after the formal complaint was already filed, after the school was already in trouble. He paused. Think about the timing. By that point, staying silent would have looked worse than speaking up. If the investigation uncovered her family's earlier report, and it would have eventually, she'd have looked like she was part of the cover-up. Then he said quietly, her testimony may have been strategically timed, not brave. I felt sick, like actually physically sick. I sat down in the chair across from his desk, and I just tried to breathe. My mind kept going back through everything. Every lunch with Persephone. Every time she'd sat across from me in the cafeteria and asked how chemistry was going, every study session, every single time she'd pulled out her graded test and put it next to mine so we could compare. She'd watched me drown. She'd had a rope the entire time, and she'd only thrown it when other people were already watching. When not throwing it would have made her look bad. I kept thinking about that day in January, the way she'd looked at me across the lunch table, the way she'd said, I've been wanting to tell you, but I was afraid. I'd believed her. I'd felt grateful. I'd thought she was risking something for me. But now I could see it differently. She hadn't been afraid for me. She'd been afraid of being found out. Augustin must have seen something on my face because his voice got softer. He said, I know this is hard, but I need you to be careful right now. Don't confront anyone until we understand the full picture. There may be more in these files. He asked me to come back tomorrow. I lay in bed in the dark staring at the ceiling, and all I could see was Persephone's face. That look she'd had at lunch in January. The way her eyes had gotten big and worried. The way she'd leaned in close like she was sharing something dangerous. The worst part was that I'd hugged her. I'd thanked her. I'd called her brave. I'd told people she was one of the reasons I'd been able to fight back. I'd given her credit she hadn't earned, and she'd taken it without blinking. The next morning I called my mother. I told Beatrice everything. I told her about the file. I told her about the list. I told her about the memo from Alfonso. I told her that Persephone had known about Mr. Whitfield almost a full year before she'd said anything to me. And then I waited. Beatrice was quiet. The kind of quiet where someone is deciding whether or not to say something they've been holding on to for a long time. Then Beatrice said, I need to tell you something. The connection I used to reach Augustin. It wasn't random. She paused again. Then she said, a few months before you came to us about Mr. Whitfield, a woman at my church told me something. She'd heard from another parent that someone at your school had reported a teacher for racist behavior. She'd heard the school had buried it. She didn't know the teacher's name. She didn't know which family had made the report. She just had a feeling that something was wrong. That's why I pushed you toward Augustin, because I knew he'd been watching that school for years. Beatrice's voice got quieter. She said, I didn't know it was Persephone's family. I didn't have any names. I didn't have proof of anything. I should have told you sooner. My mom had known something was being hidden. She hadn't known the details, but she'd known enough to push me toward Augustin, and she'd still sat across from me at our kitchen table months earlier and told me to keep my head down. She'd been trying to protect me. She'd been scared for me, a black girl at a school full of wealthy white families, and she'd been doing what she thought would keep me safe while quietly working behind the scenes to get me real help. I told her I wasn't angry, but my voice came out flat. No warmth in it, just words. Beatrice heard it. We said goodbye a minute later. That evening my phone rang again. It was my father. Jace's voice was warm when I picked up. He said, your mother told me everything. I just want you to know that I'm proud of you. I could hear him choosing his words carefully. He said, you did what we couldn't do. You stood up. That landed somewhere deep in my chest. But then he kept talking. He said, just be careful about burning bridges with Persephone. Her family has influence at that school. You still have a summer left at Augustin's firm. You don't want enemies. I sat there holding the phone and I felt something shift inside me. Not anger exactly, more like a sad kind of understanding. Even my father was afraid of what the truth might cost us. I told him I loved him. I told him I'd be careful. I didn't tell him that being careful and being silent were two different things. The next morning I went back to Augustin's office. He was already waiting for me. There were papers spread across his desk, more than the day before. He told me to sit down. He slid a stack of papers across the desk and said, it's worse than I thought. Alfonso hadn't just received the report from Persephone's parents. He'd received 2 other complaints from black families in prior years. 2 other families had gone to the headmaster, separately, at different times. Alfonso had dismissed all 3. And then Augustin showed me the part that made my blood go cold. He pulled out an internal memo from Alfonso. It was addressed to the school's academic review committee. And in it, Alfonso had written, Mr. Whitfield's rigor is an asset to the school's academic reputation. Complaints reflect adjustment difficulties, not systemic issues. I read it twice. Adjustment difficulties. That was how Alfonso had described what was happening to us. We weren't being discriminated against. We were just having trouble adjusting. Alfonso had put that in writing. He'd been protecting Mr. Whitfield on purpose. Not because he believed Mr. Whitfield was fair. Because Mr. Whitfield's high failure rate made the school look hard. The school's reputation had been built on the backs of students like me. I thought about the day Alfonso had called my parents in, the way he'd been so apologetic, the way his face had gone white. I'd thought at the time that he was shocked, that he felt guilty, but now I knew the truth. He hadn't been shocked. He'd been scared. His panic that day hadn't been because he found out something terrible was happening. It was because he realized he was about to get caught. Then Augustine's desk phone rang. He glanced at the screen, held up one finger to me, and answered. I watched his face as he listened. His jaw tightened. His eyes got harder. He didn't say much. Then he hung up. He set the phone down slowly. He looked at me and said, that was Persephone's mother. She just called the school's board chair. She's claiming you stole confidential files from my office. Everything in my body went tight. Augustine must have seen it on my face because he leaned forward and said, don't panic. He said, she's scared. Scared people make mistakes. That phone call just proved they know what's in that file. He tapped the stack of papers on his desk. He said, think about what she just did. If she didn't know what was in these documents, why would she be panicking? Why would she be trying to frame you as a thief? She wouldn't, unless she knew exactly what you'd found. He leaned back. He said, they thought they buried this. Now they're trying to bury you, but they just handed us everything we need. I was still sitting in Augustine's office when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Persephone. It said, hey, can we talk? I heard something weird is going on. Are you okay? I held the phone up and showed Augustin. He read it. His expression didn't change. He said, don't respond yet. I put the phone back in my pocket. I could feel it sitting there like something heavy, that little green text bubble with all its fake concern. About an hour later, I was driving home when my phone rang. It was Beatrice. I pulled over. She said, Persephone's mother called me on my personal phone. Beatrice told me Persephone's mother had said I was making accusations. She'd said I was jeopardizing Augustin's reputation. She'd said I was putting myself in a bad position. Beatrice paused. Then she said, she told me, our daughters are friends. Let's handle this between families. Between families. Like this was some little misunderstanding. Like what had happened to me, what had happened to 23 students, was something that could be smoothed over with a phone call between mothers. Beatrice told me she hadn't said anything. She'd just listened, but I could hear it in her voice. She was shaken. She said, said, "These people have money and connections we don't have. Are you sure about this?" I heard the fear underneath the question, but I also heard her asking me to be sure, not telling me to stop, asking me to be sure, and I was. I said, "I've never been more sure about anything." Beatrice didn't argue. She didn't push back. She just said, "Okay." And that one word carried more weight than a whole speech would have. The next few days moved fast. Augustin didn't waste a single hour. He contacted the 2 other former black students who testified during the original investigation against Mr. Whitfield. He told them about the cover-up. He asked them if they'd be willing to testify again, not about Mr. Whitfield this time, but about the cover-up itself. Both of them said yes. When Augustin told me about the call, he said one of them had gone quiet for a long time and then said, "I always knew the school knew. I just couldn't prove it." That hit me hard, because I knew exactly what that felt like. Augustin also reached out to a former teacher, someone who'd left the school quietly about 3 years earlier. The teacher agreed to provide a written statement confirming that faculty had discussed Mr. Whitfield's bias in private. Multiple teachers had known, but Alfonso had made it clear that they were to stay out of it. I thought about that text Persephone had sent me, the casual one, the friendly one. I thought about responding. I typed out 3 different messages and deleted all of them. None of them felt right, because a text wasn't enough. I needed to be in the same room as her. I needed to see her face. I went to Augustin. I told him I wanted to meet with Persephone, face to face. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "I'd advise against that. From a legal standpoint, anything you say to her could be used to complicate things." I understood that. I did. But this wasn't just legal. I said, "She was my friend. She sat next to me in class. For almost a year, she watched me struggle, and she knew why, and she said nothing. I need to look her in the eye. I need her to tell me why." Augustin was quiet. He'd been a black student at that same school once. He knew what it felt like to trust someone and find out that trust had limits. He finally said, "Okay." Then he pointed at me. "But you go in knowing exactly what she did. Every date, every document, every choice she made, and you don't let her rewrite it. You don't let her cry her way out of it. You go in with the truth and you hold on to it no matter what she throws at you." I told him I would. I picked a quiet cafe about 20 minutes from Augustin's office, somewhere neutral. When I walked in, Persephone was already sitting at a table near the back. She saw me and her face lit up the way it always did, that big warm smile, and she stood up and hugged me before I could even put my bag down. She smelled like the same perfume she'd worn in high school. She pulled back and looked at me and said, "Are you okay? My mom said something about files." I'm honestly so confused about what's going on. Her voice was perfect, concerned, a little worried, just the right amount of confusion. I sat down across from her. I didn't smile. I just looked at her, and I said, "I found the report you gave to Alfonso from March, a full year before you told me anything at lunch." Persephone's face didn't move the way a surprised person's face moves. There was no confusion, no "what are you talking about" moment. Her expression just froze, and in that half second of stillness, I saw it. Recognition. She'd known this moment would come. She recovered fast, though. She leaned back in her chair and shook her head and said, "That wasn't me. That was my parents. They heard something and reported it. I didn't even know the details." I reached into my bag. I pulled out the photocopy I'd made of Alfonso's memo. I unfolded it on the table between us. I read it out loud. "Per P's report to Headmaster Alfonso." I looked up at her. I said, "P is you, Persephone. You reported it. You told Alfonso what you heard at the country club, and then you watched me fail for months." Her eyes started to get wet. Her voice changed, got softer, smaller. She said, "I didn't understand what was happening. I told Alfonso and he said he'd handle it. I thought it was handled." I didn't look away from her. I said, "You were comparing grades with me every week. You saw my B's, you saw your A's,